Boom, boom. Happy Monday. Oh, yeah. Let's see here. See here. Up, 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 up. Mhm.
All right.
So today, you pull, you tank.
I need my hats. Stand by.
All right. Oh, got that blast. What's going on, Luke? Good morning, Mr. YouTube. Hey, Stellar. Good morning, Warriors of Light. Dude, Stellar, your freaking logo is incredible. Incredible. I guess I'll tweet this out. Help shape Twitter's future? Don't ask me now. All right. You pull it, you tank it. And the wheat, go. Perfect. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Anthony. Good morning, Cryptus. Good morning, Wes. Good morning, Dark Shadow Saver. How are y'all doing today? I got my coffee. How you doing, Chris?
Tired.
Yeah. How was your weekend?
Good. Finished my try.
Yeah. Like you actually did the try.
I did the try. I did it.
Wow, dude.
I did it.
Did you sleep good at all last night, or was it like soreness?
Somehow in 90 minutes, you can have identical body fatigue and soreness to an entire day of skiing. That's what it feels like. It feels like an entire day of skiing. Wow. My legs are sore and everything else just feels like a little bit beaten up.
Okay.
It was rainy.
Yeah. Yesterday was raining. We had to go down to Fort Worth. And
it was rainy.
It was a good day. Kids had fun.
It was really rainy during the bike. Mm-hmm. It had dried up a little bit by the run. So the bike was, you had to be careful in the turns. Mm-hmm. So, but my estimated bike time was 46 minutes.
Okay.
I came in at 51 minutes. My estimated run time, I estimated 30 minutes. My PR was 30:34, and I came in at 29:02.
Yeah.
And then my estimated swim time, I put 9 minutes in the registration, but I had never done better than a 13 in practice.
Oh, yeah.
And I came in at between like 10 and 11.
Oh, that's impressive. The swimming, I did a sprint triathlon, and the swimming was like literally the hardest part.
That's what this was. Yeah.
Yeah. The swimming was like the biking and the running I had. I was like, that was great. Like I would do that again. Is there a duathlon?
It's biathlons.
Yeah, biathlon. Okay, I was like, I need to get it done. Yeah, that's something that I was like, I think that's more my pace. My swimming constitutes of like I like standing in a pool.
I like that it dragged me into the swimming because the swimming's really good for you.
Yeah,
like it's really healthy. It's really low impact. It's linked to improved cognitive function. Like the swimming's really healthy. But you're right. Like I knew it was going to be the worst leg going in. Yeah. I wouldn't have done any swimming otherwise. Like it just dragged the swimming into my life, and that's why they have you do it first. You have to do it fresh, or people won't make it.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh yeah, that reminds me. I see Wes on both sides of Twitch and on the YouTube side. Also, Patrick saying, making me laugh. You guys look tired. Have you tried Healer? I hear that fixes everything. And also like number 9, baby. Thank you very much, Patrick. We were up to 11 now. So we have to make sure we deliver on a 11 pre-like show. Let's go. Let me just add this in here.
Serious glare today. That's not the one. That's not the one. Who's causing the glare, bud?
It's going up. It's going up. Thank you, guys.
Better.
Bitter, better.
Yep.
All right. Let's see.
I don't know which of those ones you went with. I sent you. You're like, do you have the
up
examples? And I was like,
yeah,
here,
all over the place.
Here, I haven't read all of these, but here, there's like 100 of them
pulled up. I have them all.
It's just people being sassy.
Yeah.
So over and over.
If you feel like there's one stronger, then we can go with that one.
So that one says 2 years ago, but like the this is what's on my feed. Tales from the Duty Finder.
1 year ago, 15 hours ago, and 20 hours ago.
That might be why. So maybe when those cycled, the old ones.
And the algorithm's like, whoa.
Yeah. But it's something that pops up from time to time. Is this like, should tanks be in charge?
That's how that's really Chris and I play though. Like when Chris was like on his black mage and I was on his tank, it's like, yeah, go ahead, start pre-pulling. We're on our way. Like I'll pull the hate, especially nowadays. And I guess that we probably should save that for the show because it's like now, like literally, legitimately, it's like
I am 99 times out of 10 in the noobs corner, but on this, buddy, you should be popping your mid either way, and you are the only class that always has AoE. So like, suck it up. Like your stance is on either way.
Well, that's what I saw some people are doing. They're literally turning off the tank stance.
I don't honestly. I don't even know why tank stance doesn't just auto enable when you're in a dungeon. There's 4 people. The tank is tanking. Period.
I mean, do we really need to make tanking even easier than it has to be? Like we've already just taken it down.
The stance is only useful in 2 tank instances.
Well, even in a 2 tank instance with Shirk, it's not like you can shirk that stuff over with
a still need stance if you're being outclassed. So if I'm tanking and my off tank is somebody like Rin or Todd,
okay,
they outgear me and they have a better rotation. I have to have the stance to outpace them. Even with Shirk, they will just eventually pass me because I'm so suboptimal compared to them, and so they are just extracting that much better DPS. I think Cloud and Chat can probably pass me as well. As I'm getting better, that's narrower. But when you talk about some of these like first time clear, if somebody like Todd is like, yeah, you should be the main tank, they have to have stance. Like that's what it's for.
Okay.
And like Shirk has a cooldown, and so like Shirk is really great for those big moments, those big like boss mechanic swaps. But there are other times that you're just trying to like get everything situated the way you wanted it the first time, especially in instances like EX4 where like people are doing like tank relative and a tank goes down. Sometimes if there's a newer tank but they're trying to keep the fight tank relative, you go ahead and say, okay, let's just do a swap now and get things back to the way they are supposed to be. So you're still practicing tank relative, you're just practicing tank relative without a death.
Okay.
Even though there was a death.
Yeah,
because the death inverts everything.
From a programming perspective, and we're just jumping in. Like that's where we are today. Like we're just going in on the topic because those are really good points. That it would be, I think, insincere to try and recreate just that moment. Like hold on to that thought, Chris, and repeat it here after we run the intro. We'll make it pretty all in the edit. But when it comes down to it, it's that the programmer in me is like, okay, situationally, forcing that choice. Oh man, like it just seems interesting, right? Because we've already seen how that tank stance, like legitimately, if it's on, there's just no possible way to catch it, I guess, unless, like you said, like you're in an 8-man with another tank and they have that stance on. And so it in and of itself is like, oh, you want to be the tank? Turn this button on and then do your AoE at a minimum. And
It's what
so,
allows for tank cob. It's what allows for these 8 tank pulls, is that they get to decide, everybody's doing max rotation and they get to rotate who is taking the hit. So it allows for some weird situations. I think in dungeons specifically, when you're in there with Duty Finder, the other problem is that it's most commonly forgotten when people sink down. Because stance is level 4, technically, if you went and found like a level 2 fate, when you synced into it, you would not have stance.
right.
And so if stance was instead moved to being a level 1 ability, then maybe they could work something out where it doesn't have to drop off when you sink. And that would also alleviate a lot of the pain. Because a lot of the pain is that I sink into leveling roulette and I forget it's off. But what you're talking about today is now people are maliciously turning it off, and it won't stop that. It's really hard to stop people that are aggressively trying to hurt other players. Just because you have to play the game for them. You have to take over. You have to autopilot. If you have malicious actors, like, no programmer can account for that.
Right. And that's where, like, I think to your point, like I would actually advocate more for having tank stance stay on when you sink, because that literally is one of the things. And it's usually the first pull. You usually forget about it because majority of the content you're running, especially once you're at level cap and you're like, I'm doing the experts, it doesn't fall off there. I'm doing the 60, 70, 80, it stays on. And then you level sync and all of a sudden you're like, okay, and it's gone. And you're like, what happened? And it's usually the first pull where we're like, wait, why is everything running off to the healer or to the damage dealers? And then you turn it back on and you're immediately on the top of the list.
I run simple bars for my like beast gauge. And so it's not as visually significant when you're in stance versus not. So sometimes in expert roulette, out of habit, I click the stance button. And because those don't sync, I just turned it off. And then I still mess up the first pull, and I'm like, oh crap. But thankfully, like, stance is a flat 10x to enmity generation for anybody not familiar with 14 stance. And so you turn it on. Tanks have AoE in all group content, and you slam 1 or 2 AoEs and you fly past everybody else. And so it's just, it's really not hard. There's also stuff in WoW where, like, positionals matter. There's things in various games where you're managing statuses, you're managing afflictions, you're managing certain damage types. But in 14, at least, especially in dungeon content, the tank is designed to take all hits. It doesn't matter if it takes them from the back. It doesn't matter if it takes them from the front. The tank takes all hits. And they always have AoE, even when other classes don't. And so, like, they're really designed to take the threat, especially in dungeons. And the mitigation in dungeons is outrageous. Arm's length is most commonly used in raid stuff for its anti-knockback capability. But it is in dungeons, it is outrageously powerful as mitigation.
It's a beautiful ability. That's one of the things when we talk about teaching teaching people to tank from other MMOs. One of the things that you pointed out to me that I never really understood, but then when when all of a sudden hearing you talk about it made sense, was like when I think of slow, I think of my attack speed. That's a very Final Fantasy-esque spell and status debuff, wherein when people coming over from WoW, they're like, oh, that's me moving slow, as opposed to where in 14 it's heavy. And so it's like, okay, there is this translation that still needs to occur, because people see that ability and they sleep on it. They're like, I don't care if the enemies are slow. Like, I'm standing right there. But
you're like, I'm not kiting them. I'm going to stand there. So
it
doesn't do anything to make them move slower.
Right. You're actively, like, reducing your incoming damage. It's a great mitigation ability, and it's wonderful. And then also you took like a reprisal as that when they made that an AoE. Like, there's so much really great mitigation for these really big pulls. And so that's always something that I think is just, it's fun. It's fun to kind of get those big pulls in. It's fun to kind of, like, dodge and weave, and at the same time, balance those mitigations and cooldowns. But to the subject at hand, specifically, when we start talking about not just necessarily the ease of tanking, but how people ultimately respond to it, there's a little history I have here to kind of give guys some context. Like, coming from 11, there was a culture that, if you're going to, especially with how, like, aggro and how all that systems worked, like, there was a responsibility that you had. We were playing with Kevin. I remember that some people got mad at Kevin because he was a black mage and he would be able to pull off these really big damage numbers, and he would rip hate. And so there was a part in terms of casting and even healing that you had to be like, I need to actually slow down my damage because the tank doesn't get provoke for another 10 seconds and I will rip the hate off of him. So I want to wait till he provokes, because in 11, provoke actually wasn't just put you at the top of the list. It was just another aggro hate generation mechanic. It accounted for some kind of, I'll say, a flat fee. More Final Fantasy 11 experts might say there's some kind of calculation to it, right? So I can understand that culture because it was the same concept. We were playing with Jelly as well, and that came into 14. And I remember you would find somebody who was just doing, back in the day when 14 had a different kind of hate and aggro managed mechanic, was all right, if that's what you want to do, I don't need to heal you. And that's a way that I'm going to teach you kind of through shame, that isn't culturally accepted. So this isn't anything new from my perspective. And when Chris and I have played together, when he was on his black mage and I was on a tank, I was like, yeah, go grab whatever. I'm going to get the hate off of you. Let's go ahead and keep trying to chain these things together, because we already were in a group. This is something we were fine with. And typically nobody else was frustrated because generally these were pre-made groups. But when it comes down to matchmaking now, there's kind of a culture maybe shift in this regards. Chris, I don't know if you said you got a couple of props. I don't know if you want to use those today, but do you want to kind of take us through what we're looking at here on screen?
Yeah. So YP/YT is you pull, you tank. The idea is that if somebody other than the tank grabs something, especially when it's intentional, I don't believe that's arm veil, somebody just body pulls.
Right.
I think it's when you see somebody running ahead, tossing ranged attacks, you pull it, you tank it. And depending on the class, some of the classes are fine with that. Like Dragoon's whatever. As long as I'm getting heals, I can manage that.
Yeah.
But obviously for things like Black Mage, that's going to become problematic much quicker. So they're in Swallow's Compass, and they're in there with their friend who's a Sprout. And then the tank is making the dungeon go very slowly. And some dungeons that feels more painful than others. Mm-hmm. Most dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV stop you at a double or triple pull. So it's not like some games where they're like, well, what do they expect me to do? Pull the entire dungeon? You can't. You're going to get to a locked door or a bridge that needs to appear, or something that is gating your progress until everything goes down. Trash in this game does not drop experience. As one last thing to talk on here, trash does not drop experience. Only bosses drop experience. That's a relatively recent change. And in most modern dungeons, there's no way to dodge it. So basically you just pull your 2 or 3, unlock the door, do that until you get to each of your bosses. And so if somebody is pulling one pull and then just sitting there until each and every last little thing stops, becomes less efficient to do your AoE rotations as you get down to that last monster, and then you run to the next one. And there are classes where there are timers and things built in. So then that run time starts to mess up their rotation, and they're trying to play their class. Not to mention that when you sign up for a dungeon, you know there's going to be a wait time, but you expect a dungeon in Final Fantasy to be somewhere between 10 and, let's say, 25 minutes. And that's a typical experience. But when you have one person that is intentionally, not through failures, but intentionally saying, I'm going to go AFK, or I'm going to take off my stance because you pulled the next pack, then you can start to get into these 30 and 40-minute runs, which can be really frustrating when it's not being done because somebody's new. There's nobody in here saying, hey, I'm just new at tanking, I'm really not comfortable with a double pull. Mm-hmm. It typically comes out as, well, you tagged that, so now I'm going to turn off my stance for the remainder of the dungeon. And you can't kick people while there's a loot timer active. So the whole thing just spirals out of control, and it becomes a question of who can either be the bigger person and the more passive aggressive person first. Those are your choices. You either have to chase it down the rabbit hole, or you have to pull out and just let them be right.
Right. Well, we also know tank privilege is a thing in terms of queue times, right? So if you've been waiting, especially as a DPS, for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on whatever the matchmaking time is, that tank knows that, especially if it isn't a loot timer, that if they do get, kicked out of the group, I don't think that immediately applies a penalty to them. Let me know, chat, if I'm incorrect. The penalties that I'm aware of is that if you fail to take the match make within 24 hours 3 times, then they're going to start having that cooldown penalty before you can jump into content again. But regardless, it's like, okay, cool. I can always just jump back in. Or what you end up looking for is somebody wanting just to straight up kick, just leave. Then anybody else can leave in that regard. So they're like, okay, you can always kind of reset that. It's always unfortunate whenever we have these kind of stories in this regards. It's always unfortunate whenever you get into a group and somebody just is like, it's hard because you always are asking yourselves, like, are you incompetent or are you just trying to be a jerk? And I think overall we've seen less of that in game, at least from my personal experience, due to the updated reporting and mechanisms in the game itself, not just in terms of like chat, but we've seen I remember getting into a group with a guy like a year or 2 years ago, something like that, in Shadowbringers, and we were very carefully trying to give them advice because they wouldn't turn on take stance, they wouldn't do these things. We were in Armvale of all things, and we just couldn't get the clear. Like there's just no way we were progressing, and we were trying to be very nice about it. Like all of us were like, we weren't trying to be hostile, but eventually we had to actually report them because it became very clear that they didn't care. They have absolutely no idea. They'd run off into a corner and just stand there for a little while. And so that kind of, why you see Tales from the Duty Finder as kind of a key aspect here, because man, when you roll the dice, like I think 9 times out of 10, that's my hope, that you get good experiences. But my goodness, there's always going to be that time where you're just going to run into somebody who, and it could go in either direction of it. But on to the subject at hand, in terms of you pull, you tank, how do you feel about that now? Matchmaking, in my mind, pre-made doesn't matter. It's not a story. But in terms of matchmaking,
contextually is where it hits the road. I don't think there's just one solution fits all, and we need to shove all groups into that. There are times for slow groups. Especially in lower level dungeons, healers have pretty restrictive kits. So if a healer is uncomfortable, tanks need to slow down. They just need to, because the healer will struggle, and that's okay, right? Like if we want people to get better at the game, if we want people to enjoy this game that we say is so good, they need to be able to learn, and that's fine. At that point, the tank needs to be helping. Hey, this pack gets a little bit bigger, I'm going to pop some mitigation. They need to be helping out. If you get my first time doing the new trial that got added to 2.0 when they redid all that for the MSQ roulette, we almost used the whole lockout because we had a tank and a healer that were both brand new, Sprout Icon. This was their first time into this level of content, and neither could help make up for the other one's newness. And so we just struggled, and it was rough. It just was. So I think at that point, like, we have to just remember we're all playing a game, and there is this idea of you don't pay my sub. Yes, but they do pay their sub. So there is this like counterpoint of like, you're taking away from their experience. So basically, like what happened in this exact example is after the area change, they went and pulled a 3-pack, noticing that the tank wasn't with them because the tank was stopping and starting between pulls. This happens because of load times. This happens because somebody else is distracted doing other things. And so maybe they're just slow. Maybe they're managing their inventory, whatever. They're just slow. And so they just manage it. But they noticed that towards the end of the pull that they just handled, they were willing to deal with it. The tank had made it through that load screen and was just standing there. And that's where I think the tank went wrong. I don't think it's the tank said, hey, can you slow down? I'm really struggling to keep up with this. This is my first time in the dungeon. It's the tank. They pulled it. They were tanking it. But now you got there, and all you have to do is start AoEing, and you will slowly rip off of them anyway, because you're at 10x. So even if you don't want to have provoke and I don't even know, I haven't tanked in weeks, I don't know where provoke is on my bar.
Right.
Fine. Just do what you normally would have been doing, which is AoEing with tank stance on. And so I think that's where the tank became wrong here. Not, hey guys, like I'm really struggling to keep up with this, and then they keep pulling. At least from the clip that we see here. Now, after that, it gets really passive aggressive because then it looks like either the dungeon ended and they left, or the healer and their buddy just left. So then the tank says like, okay, you don't get to just say something mean then leave. So they world hop to go say hello. And so they go over and say, being last doesn't make you right. And then they world hop again. They probably were still sitting near the Aetheryte. So then the guy's like, haha, then I couldn't send my message to them. It's like, well, yeah, they weren't sticking around. They were leaving you a voicemail because they wanted the last word instead of you leaving the last word. So at that point, like you're trying to measure like, hey, we were both jerks, but their jerk yardstick was longer than mine. So haha, like it. And then I have to go post to Reddit. So like you're still the last word. So like at that point, I think everybody starts to look like they can't keep it together. But the idea is the same. If the tank had just gotten there and started AoEing, none of this had to happen.
Right. It's a very simple solution to the problem. Now, I want to kind of take this and kind of build off of what Patrick's saying, in that talking about how new players saying that players should just go play a single player game is the worst direction for the health of a multiplayer game. And I think that if you're using a random dungeon finder, you get what you get, and you can't, I guess, complain. You know, we always tell the kids, you get what you get and you can't throw a fit. But in terms of that, now we also, and our unveil aside, right? We know there are certain dungeons that are not, single player support, enhanced, trust support enabled. Do we think that we're going to see more of that kind of mindset as like more and more dungeons become and have that as an option for players to choose to play? What do you think?
I think it's going to get more vocal. Because the people, I think right now, it's not always fun to drive behind somebody slow, but like if they've got like a student driver sticker on their back bumper, you're like, it is what it is. And if that group goes into trust dungeons, then now every time somebody's slow, there is a chance that they're also going to be snarky. And that's where it makes everybody frustrated, is when it goes like slow is what puts people on edge. And that's fine. Tell us to suck it up. Like, hey, I don't want to go fast. You can't make me. Okay. And I'll quietly sit here and say, man, I wish this was a faster group. But it's fine. It's really fine. But when instead they go, oh, so you want to go fast? You're one of those people. And then they call me some name. It's like, okay, you already know I'm on edge. So like my in-laws came this weekend, and I was trying to watch what I ate because I had a triathlon. Mm-hmm. And so we all went out to Oktoberfest, and they were drinking beer and eating brats. And I was trying to be a little more careful, and there wasn't food there enough for me. And so I was hungry, and they had said, we're going to leave by this time. And then they went off and found more booths. And so that time came and went. So it had been like 30 or 45 minutes since I thought we were leaving. So in my head, I thought I was getting food that I could eat. And instead I was just hungry. And my father-in-law comes up and goes, are you hungry? Are you a grumpy bear? Grumpy, grumpy, grumpy bear, and starts elbowing me. And it's like, you already know that I'm frustrated. I'm being an adult and I'm being fine. And like, I could just feel my face getting red.
Just
like you found somebody that you know is struggling, and you just intentionally said, how can I make their day worse? Like you didn't say, oh, I'm going to joke with my friend who's in a good mood. Like you intentionally went and said, somebody has self-isolated. I had gone off by my own. And said, I'm just going to wait over here until you guys finish with all that. And he came over, and I said, what part of you coming over and doing that made you think it would make my day better? And he goes, oh, you really are hungry. I go, yes, I really am hungry. I came over here and stood near the car, and I'm waiting calmly and quietly by myself. He goes, oh, I'm sorry. And so so the context matters, right?
Right.
Like, I'm not just going to yell at people, but like I did the self-isolating thing. And so I think that's what happens is like people go, well, how does everybody not know exactly what I'm thinking? How do they not know I like to run dungeons slowly? I like to run dungeons quickly. Well, did you say that? Did you at any point interact in any way that says that? Like, oh, they click your search info and you're Omni 90, and then they double pulled. Of course they double pulled. The double pulling is the typical, it is the standard. And that's because tanking has been made so much simpler that most tanks are very, very comfortable double pulling.
Yeah. And I agree with what one Chanson says here. Some players just act like children. And sometimes you never know if they do. Like my concern with that is like, and I've talked about this especially with their Discord. So if you guys are part of the Discord, thanks for being a part of this community. But I've stated multiple times, like Chris and I don't have time to manage adults. And it's like the expectation within the community is that we're adults here. And if you can't have if you're going to butt heads, because guess what? People do. We've got people who love Sony. We got people who love Xbox. And at the end of the day, like, I could care less what platform is your preference or what favorite video game is your preference or what tank is your preference. I like the discussion, but sometimes you're having a bad day, right? Like, we all should be allowed to have bad days, but what I would always encourage people is that recognize that you're having a bad day and be like, guys, I'm just not feeling it today. I'm just gonna step away. Like, that's what I've learned to do as I've become an older man, is like, you know what? Like, I'm not my best self today.
And I don't need other people to have a worse day because of me. I'm
right.
just gonna go be grumpy somewhere else.
I'm gonna go be a grump over here, and then I'm gonna laugh at myself because it's like, what am I doing, Brian? You know, like, because that's usually the thing. It's like, once it's like, okay, right, food is a real, like, are you hangry? Is what my wife says. I get
really
like,
hangry.
Yeah, it's like,
I have to self-isolate if there's not going to be food.
Right. It's like, okay. And the only other thing that drives me nuts as an adult is just loud, copious amounts of noise. And I've chosen that as a father. Like, I've self-volunteered and signed up for that. So my brother got me a pair of like the earbuds. And so that's been a huge help, because it's like, I'm not even listening to anything. I just want something to cut down that, that shrill thing that is a temporary kind of thing. I like, at some point, like, the kids will, not be as loud as they are. But it's like, yeah, so it's those are kind of the two things that I know. But what I do is, you step away. I go be a grump over in the corner. I'm not ruining anybody else's day, and I come back as an adult. Same thing within the Discord. It's like, listen, like, the assumption is we're all adults. Now, when an adult is acting like a child, like, there is nothing more frustrating. And I have to, like, it's like, I'm not going to change your world. I have no control over you, but, like, please tell me, please, like, we run this community for adult, but please tell me you're joking. Like, don't be like that. We're talking about video games. Thankfully, that's where I guess kind of the buck hits the road. Now, on that note, Chris, do you have any other kind of final thoughts regarding you pull, you tank? Because a part of me in a pre-made likes that aspect when you get that synergy, and it's like, especially with, like, if you're playing a ranged, like, that was how it was. Like, in 11, like, you would have, like, the puller was a role. It wasn't, the tank wasn't pulling. The puller was somebody who was bringing the enemies to you, and the tank would pick them up.
Tanks have ranged attacks at super low level. So in low level content, it's like, no, go grab that. Well, I don't want to have to drag all that. Me and the melee are going to sit here and do work. You go get that over here. Go bring that in. And that's the other etiquette, right? If something gets pulled and you didn't mean to, if you take threat or whatever, take it to the tank. Take it to the tank.
Yeah.
They're not trying to get 10,000 steps on their pedometer. Bring it to them. They're managing this. Especially once the pull gets to be 6, 8, 10 things. At that point, they're watching their health bar and they're watching their cooldowns. And, especially if they're not super comfortable in that situation, they may be zoomed all the way in mentally on to say, okay, as soon as that defensive is up, I'm going to pop the next one. And so let them focus on helping the healer keep them alive and bring it to them. Mm-hmm. And in theory, they just have a blender of AoE going. So if you just bring it in, it should just naturally get grabbed. Because they should just be sitting there hitting their 2-button AoE combo over and over and over and over, while spamming mitigation. Mm-hmm. So I just remember that we all got paired to go in there and survive this together, and that we're all in there to get whatever our reward is. You're in there for experience or loot or whatever you're in there for. And like, it's really okay. I don't know why we're having to move into this, like, now tanks are this universally respected position, and if the tank wants to be a jerk, they're allowed to be. I do think in general the tank sets the pace, but that doesn't give them unilateral ability to ruin everybody else's day. Like, if people are just like, hey, we got through the pull, we didn't notice you weren't through the load zone, we pulled the next 3 mobs, and we're gonna handle it. Okay, well then catch up and go grab that one. If you don't want to make that a double pull, then just catch up with them and stop. Mm-hmm. And then vocalize. Just say, hey, I really prefer to do things one at a time.
Yeah.
And they can sigh really loudly, but you don't hear that.
That would be something, because I see over in Twitch chat, and speaking of which, guys, if you are able to lurk over on the Twitch, that is a great way of helping support the channel and the content. As an FYI, the links are all here on YouTube. But I see Twitch chat talking about like ClearDev says would love a dedicated puller in the game, takes a lot of pressure off the tank, and essentially and then Flareheart following this up saying desperately kind of reinforce that others can actually pull mobs and take them to the tank, because that is essentially now, but that is in my mind kind of a cultural shift. When we talk about meta in MMOs specifically, how I always view it is that people always say, yes, there's always a meta. But I was like, meta is such a strong component when matchmaking is involved, because it becomes this kind of unwritten rule set that players can follow so that they're not necessarily all completely out in right field, right? Like essentially a meta would be in 14, if you have a job stone, equip it, but you'll still see sometimes like you'll get matched with a class and you're like, whoa, that's a shocker. It's like, okay, I haven't seen that in a while. But so a meta would essentially be like, yes, if you have a job stone, use your job stone. But in this regards, where that aspect, you would need to kind of have that as that general thing. And maybe then the culture could shift to where a tank could let you know if he's not comfortable with that. Like, hey guys, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not geared enough for that. One example from my personal history would be there was a tank back in the day where like all the gear that the tank would equip on their right side was like you could put strength based stuff because that's how their damage was calculated. So their vitality was just abysmal. And I remember being a healer, the hardest I've ever played this game, like the hardest content I've ever done, having done Savage, have not done Ultimates, but having done Savage content in the game, the hardest was this one leveling dungeon where the tank had no, like it was just like I was healing using everything to try and keep them up. And I was sweating, like, because it was like I'm just jamming on the controller, like cast, please cast, because he wasn't in that way. And so essentially, ultimately, what I'm getting at is that the ideal will be is like if a tank is not comfortable with that mindset, then maybe then we have that voice. But I don't know how we go about changing that culture just from here alone. But it doesn't bother me, especially with I just press button and I'm automatically at the list. So I have. It seems more fun to me. Especially in that regards, I have more fun when things are rocking and rolling and things are going. So that's just my perspective. Chris, you got any final thoughts?
No, I'm ready to talk about some Guild Wars. Last week we got off onto kind of some vertical progression stuff, and we've been talking about gearing a lot lately within Final Fantasy XIV. And so I wanted to talk through horizontal progression within Guild Wars for Brian and kind of translate some of that, because while he's played Guild Wars, and some of you may have played Guild Wars, I wanted to kind of translate and talk about the pros and cons as we look at that system when it becomes an entire game, when a whole game focuses horizontal, because it's just different. And then I'm going to stream some dragon progression on Guild Wars. So
now, do you need to take an ad break over on Twitch, or are we good to just jump right into it?
I don't know.
Who knows?
Who even can now? I don't have my dashboard up. I was using OBS for chat.
I like this. Cosmos says, as a healer, if tank's not using mitigation, I let them die. I have the power of life and death.
All right, we'll run an ad break. I'm gonna get some coffee, actually.
All right, sounds good.
I'm dragging. Yeah, I didn't know which one we'd pull up, so I had some hats in case they were funny, but actually I read through that one while you were talking, and those people were just being jerks.
We'll save funny hats for funny drama time. You still think that the aggro is a healer tank thing? One of the things I try to do as a DPS is to try and get my aggro as high as possible. Like I'm never going to take it off the tank, but I try to be as absolutely tight on the rotation as I possibly can. Stokes says, I just crafted a legendary greatsword in Guild Wars 2, and the dopamine hits hard due to the grind involved. Do you feel like that ever falls off? Because it's something that's interesting that it's like when you have that and you get those different options to it's like that's what we'll talk about here. Chris, did you get your coffee?
I did. We have 60 seconds left of ads. Yeah, it's cold brew.
Oh, okay. I was like,
It's cold
That
brew.
is literally the fastest coffee machine I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's just cold brew.
Guys, I'm gonna take 5 seconds and I got myself a coffee. Like,
yeah, it's that fast. And then, as an announcement, on the 30th, Brian and I are going to be doing our thank you stream for you guys pushing us over our sub goal over on Twitch. Makes a huge difference in both of our lives. And I got some stuff to give away. So you guys remember the bingo cards? You guys asked about that, and they said they would send me some merch. I've got some really fun merch, so we will be getting that, and then I will mail that to you guys. I need to go look at what postage costs are and make sure that I'm saying it in a way I can follow up on.
Yeah,
I'm a handful of people in Australia, and I just want to make sure that I'm not sending you like a $20 Mog Station item for $100 of postage. And I only know that because I would love to just say globally, but then we sent my sister some clothes that my wife sewed for her daughter in Romania, and it was $85 worth of shipping. And it was like, you can buy some really nice baby clothes for $85. So
yeah, I'll just send you $85.
I want to make sure I'm following through on that, but we have some really
just let me know what your PayPal is, bud. Let me just PayPal you the money. You do whatever you need with it.
Okay, we're out of ads.
Awesome. That's absolutely so funny. And true. Thank you guys so much for the 26 likes on this live show, and we're going to jump into our second topic because we're going to be testing out the length here, because I start my job today, and so here in about 50 minutes is my first meeting. I'm excited. I got my whole setup. Like, if you guys check this out, I got a monitor laptop right there, and so that's going to be how that works. And then I've rearranged my setup, so you probably noticed my camera angle is a little bit different up here at the top. I got a monitor mount, so I have the ultra wide, but then I have my other just my 27-inch 1080p monitor that I use kind of for just capturing 1080p stuff. And so I've got the Reddit stuff up on that, and I got a monitor mount to try and mount it to the desk because the desk raises and stuff. But it wasn't tall enough. It wasn't going over the this one, so I had to send that back and try to get something so that I can get this mounted up here, so I'm not sitting here because when I raise the desk now, it actually covers up the second monitor. So it is what it is. It is what it is. What's going on? Soro says, just picked up an old gem from my parents' house, Phantasy Star Universe. Oh my gosh, dude. Ambitious of the Luminous from 2007. Going to pop in the disc and load it up. Does that still work? Do they shut down, sir? Or are you just going to play it in a single player kind of fashion? Man, that's so good. All right. That's exciting, dude. I was like, oh man, I wish they continued on with that series. I wish that when they were bringing back, when Xbox was picking it up, bringing here, that they'd also just open up all the other PSO games on Xbox as a part of Game Pass. I thought that'd be kind of cool. All right, let's see here. And we ready to jump into our second topic, Chris? I have a Final Fantasy background. I guess I was tired last night because I was like, oh, talking Guild Wars.
All right. Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Boo, 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 boo.
Chat with Twitch chat.
You're good. Yeah, I see that. Yeah. All right. So we wanted to sit down and talk today specifically about Guild Wars 2 and the horizontal progression challenges that we have. We got into just kind of an impromptu debate and discussion in our last live show, and I ran that as a video this weekend, talking about my frustrations with Final Fantasy XIV's vertical model. And I always want to be clear. It's like, I'm advocating that I think there can be some improvements to it. I understand, especially as a dad and somebody with limited time, there is a real marketing strength to being able to take a break and come back and not being behind the curves and how Final Fantasy XIV measures it. But the question that we were always trying to explore is that, is there more room for vertical progression and horizontal progression married together? Ultimately, everybody should, know, if you never catch any other videos from us, is that I understand fully that Final Fantasy XIV isn't going to be completely redone. Bringing in a horizontal progression system isn't going to happen from level 1. It just doesn't make any sense to do something that dramatic, especially because I think you're going to end up having more players frustrated by horizontal progression, because vertical progression clearly is like if you just look at the numbers alone, it's like, hey, millions and millions and millions of people understand what this system is.
Big number, go bigger.
Big number, big go bigger. Got it. Done. But ultimately, we would like to kind of pivot the idea and now talk about horizontal progression. And Guild Wars 2 is a really good example of that. In fact, even in chat, I know Stoic was saying how that they've been finishing up their legendaries, even having finished 10 legendaries and being kind of addicted to that. But the investment of time is much greater because those legendaries then continue to have their value. They're not easily then replaced, within any kind of patch update cycle itself. So Chris, why don't you you're more the resident expert Guild Wars 2 player here, having played way more of it. I got a couple of 80s, but I haven't finished any legendaries. So why don't you kind of give a good rundown of what we're talking about here today?
So most people that hang out here at Work the Game have played Final Fantasy. So we'll kind of talk in Final Fantasy terms as far as vocab, because most of the vocabulary has a direct parallel, or we can get pretty close just using Final Fantasy vocabulary. But within Guild Wars, basically, your level cap, which all MMOs have one, stops with their original expansion. The one that is now distributed for free is the free trial. So imagine if a Realm Reborn Heavensward, you get to 60, 60 is the cap, and then you stay 60 all the way into Endwalker. That is how Guild Wars works. And so leveling as a process is not something you really focus on that heavily. Everything in the game grants experience. You even earn experience items you can toss onto alts. So getting a character to 80 the first time is not that bad, and each one after that only gets easier. And when you purchase expansions, if you purchase like a collector's edition, they'll throw in a free 80. So like it gets really, really, really easy to cap characters. After that, everything in Guild Wars is account wide, and so there's to make things horizontal, to encourage the breadth of systems. Anything you've earned typically is account wide, and the only things in Guild Wars that are not account wide are things that honestly, the more you think about them, you're like, I'm kind of glad they're not. And so they've done a pretty good job of making anything you truly would never want to repeat account wide. And even a couple things that maybe I think you would want to repeat, they're done. You're done on that account. And so that is your experience now goes into what's called a mastery system. And so every time an expansion comes out, you get a series of things that you can master. And when you're doing content related to that expansion, any experience you earn gets launched onto the mastery of your choosing. You can do them in whatever order you want. You could pause one and realize you want to start another one. And when the mastery bar fills, you get to drop these mastery tokens, which are earned through doing content related to that expansion on completing that mastery. And that adds quality of life, substantial quality of life to your time in that expansion. And so if you could imagine, maybe that gave you favored aetherites in Final Fantasy XIV, maybe that made it possible to get to certain parts of the open world. Maybe that is what unlocked your bicolor gemstone vendors. And so it can vary between, oh, that's kind of nice, to, wow, I don't know how I could do the content in this expansion long term without having that mastery. And so actually, instead of people's level next to their name, it has their total masteries across all expansions. And there's a cap on that. And then that's all account wide. So every time you level up a new character, it has all those masteries, which is great. So that's where your experience goes. And it hits on a lot of what Brian talks about in Final Fantasy XIV, wanting this kind of like expansion related leveling that doesn't really end when he's leveling his alts.
Yeah.
It is possible to cap all your masteries. A casual Guild Wars 2 player, it really doesn't spend that much time at cap. Maybe they have back when they had a gap in expansions, but like I run into a lot of people that are not at cap. And so the people who've been playing for 6-9 years and they play this is their main game, yes, they're capped, but they will tell you there are other grinds that they're on. If like Stoic, you're grinding legendaries, there's other things that mastery just kind of falls away and experience is no longer your concern. So after that, we talk gearing, because once you're level 80, what would we do with gear? Basically, we have kind of 3 steps of gear. There's the gear that just falls on the ground, which is green and blue, and it's just garbage. And your first real set of gear is exotics. Think of this like your secondary tome gear. They're cheap and easy to get, but your first set, you're going to want to get into exotics as quickly as possible. It may take you a couple days, depending on how you play, to get into your first set of exotics, unless you have friends that play, in which case they're so overflowed with exotics, if you ever played games like Diablo, that they just toss them onto you. They're like, here you go. They may not be perfect, but like, let's just get you into exotics.
Yeah.
you could go through all the normal raids like this. You could do PvP doesn't care about your gear in the small man mode. You could do an enormous amount of content in this game in just exotics, but it is absolutely tome gear. It's your normal or kind of world quest gear from WoW. Or maybe heroic dungeons. It's fine. It's fine. Like you are wearing armor.
Yeah.
Then we move to Ascended. Ascended is a step up. This starts to have slots for their Mythic Plus Criterion dungeon, has a currency that you need to equip, agony resistance against taking agony. You can imagine if the agony outpaces your agony resist, you begin to just take damage. So, you're going to want to manage that. And so that allows that to have its own isolated progression, but it just has better stats across the board. And so Ascended gear is your Savage gear. You're done. If you are in full Ascended, and it can take several weeks to get a full Ascended set. Legendary exists above this, and Legendary looks way cooler and has the ability to be used across characters much easier, sharing it among across characters because it has a Legendary armory that you can like pull it out of, like WoW's heirloom system, kind of like having augmented tome sets in Final Fantasy, but it's just very convenient for anybody that uses that weapon type because multiple classes can share the same weapon type. And then it just lets you like swap stats. Like if you could just like some of the relics, like you can just readjust the materia in it to your convenience. And so if your build changes and you realize you have a different stat priority, that's not a big deal with a legendary. I don't have any legendaries. I am in mostly Ascended. And it can be a real grind to get to full Ascended. Now, from there, like there are a couple questions that come up. So Brian, as somebody that likes horizontal, but has spent most of your time just ironically in vertical progression games, what about that sounds like that's like a really great solution? And where do you think the flaws lie?
Well, I mean, the question ends up being in where horizontal has to like, and that's where it's like, in my mind, you're always looking at kind of a hybrid between the two systems where horizontal, in my experience, is that the time invested has a bigger payout. So in Final Fantasy 14 terms, me investing in crafting and gathering and in my jobs, leveling those up, that investment pays out expansion over expansion over expansion. Right now, they're not clawing levels back. I hope they never do, because ultimately that will frustrate me personally. Like there's no way to shake it. Like that will suck if that day comes. It just really depends on what they announce for 7.0. If we'll maybe see that day, if they're really following the WoW model to a T. Who knows? Well, we'll see. But in terms of it, is that when it comes down to the things that are appealing in it, is that I don't mind long grinds. In fact, that's something I enjoy. It's something even within Final Fantasy 11 is kind of the base. Like it is interesting because obviously Final Fantasy 14 has driven me more into that content, but Final Fantasy 11 before that, like there was no other game that I put more time into back in the day. 7 years now, as with 14, we're looking at 13 years, and that's just the nature of it being the game, being kind of their main flagship, investment, and it gets actually content updates. But when it comes to it, like it's the idea that content that you can invest in, like a relic or something like that, like a legendary, has value across a spectrum of content. And so it gives you the ability to say, yeah, this is going to be a grind, but when you achieve that, this is going to be something that you get to have and use and carry forward and, have it reflect in some form or fashion. So that would be the positive side of it. The downside in terms of development is that if you create something so like insane, so incredible, that like it becomes a requirement for players to jump into certain content. Imagine if, for example, there was the ARR relic. If you had the ARR relic and it was required for you to do the current raid series, otherwise you're just not going to get it clear, then that becomes that kind of requirement in and of itself, which breaks the fundamental philosophy of what Yoshi P has built into Final Fantasy 14. Now, my personal experience, though, is that I wouldn't mind if that was actually a requirement. That would be exciting. That would mean that stuff has value. And if you go and you do that, then it is essentially done. You've achieved this thing, and it now can be something that you carry with you for the next 10 years and 20 years. But development wise, that means that if it was something so powerful, you're designing fights and you're wondering like, okay, do they have this? Right. So it adds more variables as the content gets wider. But in terms of it, like setting a level cap at 80 opens up where, again, you start looking at more horizontal. Destiny 2 is a really good example of this as well. Like, yes, it's got a verticality gear score, like that exists in everything. So I say, like, the best games do have both, but it also is like I look at and invest the time in gun collection as opposed to like worrying about power specifically. But the downsides I always think is that, well, when you have a player who's achieved everything, how do you invite them back in? What is it that then you give them to chase? And verticality in its design is a very simple way of giving somebody something to chase that's easily understood, right? When you get in and you're like, oh, my gear score is 500. The gear cap is 630. Oh, okay. Then you can continue to see that progression go up and up and up. Where in the horizontal aspect, it's like, okay, well, it drives more, I guess, player choice and build variety. And you might find yourself at a disadvantage because, oh, this legendary or this set is the thing you need. And so it might feel like bar you from certain content. But then, I mean, these are all like these systems that interact, right? Because there isn't matchmaking in Guild Wars, right?
There is for some content. It's mostly when you get into raids and stuff, it's a lot of basically kind of party finder has been my experience. It's a lot of party finder, but it's a lot of unspoken party finder. I can join a fractal group and very little has to get said. I can join normal raids and 2-3 people kind of coordinate kind of what strategy we're doing. But just like in 14, that all gets done. Imagine if we were still doing the same raids. They don't get nearly as many encounters as something like 14 or Guild Wars. And so there are, you have to basically just trust that people kind of know what's going on. Mm-hmm. The jump between dungeons and fractals up to raids was very large for some people. And so they recently went in and added where they have like a rotating echo in Final Fantasy terms, where it makes everybody a little bit stronger in that one fight. And that gives people kind of the courage to go into that fight. In fights that are basically a spank and tank, where it is a DPS check or a healer check that's meant to make the fight relevant, those actually just nerf the fight for the week. And so then that courage is well placed because you are way more likely to get a clear with people who really don't know what they are doing. But in fights that are more mechanically driven, something like Final Fantasy XIV's recent P5S Devour, having 20% more health doesn't help you. And I could have 200% health. It doesn't help you because ultimately you're going to get eaten. So like it's, but it's the courage to get in there. And so I have had that counterpoint brought up to me of, well, Chris, if they weren't going to do the fight, now they are going to do the fight. Who cares if their courage is misplaced? Let's just get them in the fight. And so I think that's a big part of it. Now, what makes this horizontal in Guild Wars, after everything you said there, is one of the things you mentioned multiple times through your points is build variety. Once I get a ascended set, if I decide that I want to transfer my progress from my warrior to another heavy wearer, I want to go play, imagine in Final Fantasy terms, instead of playing warrior, I want to play paladin. All of my gear transfers. Now, Final Fantasy is very, very similar to that, except now imagine I had not played my warrior since 2017. And I had my warrior in raid gear and I've been playing black mage for the last 5 years. And now I want to try paladin. My warrior gear is still relevant because it is totally horizontal and there's nothing vertical has happened. I got my warrior to the peak then. That is still the peak to this day. And I'm going to laterally shift my growth into now I need to level paladin. I need to learn paladin. And they end up adding a little bit of build variety. And so I may realize, you know what, I want a different weapon or I want to swap some of my stat priority. And so you end up wanting to acquire multiple ascended sets, multiple legendary sets. So it's much more similar to like a Diablo player that has multiple characters. Even if those characters are the same class, they have multiple builds in something like Diablo 2, where yes, this character is done acquiring gear. It's gotten everything it can get. It will never get better. There is no more vertical progression for it.
Mm-hmm.
But my account as a whole, I'm still working towards things that really aren't better than it. They're just lateral. Where it starts to run into issues is, as you noted, is anything required? There are in encounter, there's very few things that are required once you're in full exotics. And when they are, usually a well documented group. I think 477 is current mastery cap. If you find yourself around a bunch of 450s, 470s, they can usually carry one or two people that don't have those requirements. Sometimes, like, there was one point where I have to jump across this gap and I have to have a glider that can hit this little air draft. And the air draft is a mastery upgrade. And I did not have that particular mastery upgrade done. And so what we would do is a Mesmer would drop a portal. They would jump across with their air gap, and then I would go through their portal to get to the other side. Or there's times where I have to die to a mechanic, and then I'll get rezzed on the other side because I don't have the mastery that makes that able to be survived in the way that we're doing it. Mm-hmm. But as my mastery score has risen slowly, I find that less and less I have to die, or less and less I have to be told, ignore this mechanic, we'll handle it for you. And so it gets a little bit easier to participate in the group more regularly. What is the bigger issue is build variety. In order to add things to the game and make it interesting, they have to constantly shift different builds. And so any of you who have ever played games like Warhammer 40K or Age of Sigmar or something like that, you know that sometimes you own a model and it's really good. And then through a change in the rules to add more variety to the game, this one accidentally suddenly becomes worse compared to everything else, or literally gets nerfed to give something else a day in the sun. And that doesn't feel good when you've invested all your time and energy into perfecting that one, when they're forcing you to go lateral. Mm-hmm. I finally have full legendaries on my banner warrior. And then they say, oh yeah, warrior's going to be garbage for a little while. That doesn't feel good. Right. So that's one of the issues. And then, as you noted, what happens once people have it all?
Yeah,
you can't.
Well, you can still actually, at least in how I've always worked with the horizontal, is you can actually still have like gear score increase, but what it ends up being is that the piece of, so to kind of put it in Final Fantasy terms, and again, this isn't ever going to happen in Final Fantasy 14. Like it just, it would be like Square Enix sparing no expense times 10. You know, it's like, okay, we're going to just really get this thing done. But ultimately it'd be like, imagine if your gear in 14 was harder to acquire. Like the relic system is probably a better example of this, but imagine if it's just like your general gear. You then, within that gear, and if it had various different perks and ways that kind of augmented how you decided to build out your character, you could then invest power into that gear so it became something that wasn't a glamour piece, wasn't a fashion thing. You could actually consider the fashion system in 14 a bit of horizontal progression, because if that is your be all end all, you're collecting various different looks and feels, right? But it becomes this ownership of that, and then that's something that carries forward with you across time and space in terms of the game itself. And so the thing I would love to see in terms of what I think would be feasible within the world of 14 to add a little bit of this is that, imagine if Criterion, you got to take it by content, because otherwise you fundamentally can break the game. But imagine if you're like, hey, we're going to have this mode, Deep Dungeon. And we've already seen them introduce gear that has perks within Zadnor and Bozja. But imagine if all of a sudden they said, hey, in this ARR relic, in this new Deep Dungeon, this relic does this one random thing for you, or this relic does whatever, not requiring it, but it ends up becoming like, oh, well, I never got that relic, or something like that. That's an interesting way of like, oh, I'm going to go get that. And then I'm going to kind of have some build variety within kind of a side load piece of content within the world of 14. We're seeing that within Bozja Zadnor. I would love to see something like that, already using systems that exist and giving people more reasons to collect certain things that are not, then affecting the raid. Because if you impact the raid, and we talked about this last time, like I think fundamentally that would really restructure kind of, that core piece of content that people look forward to within the races and more. But at its core, like you can still say, hey, imagine if you got that ARR relic and you're like, oh, I'm going to feed whatever currency is coming from the new Deep Dungeon. And now that relic is powered up. But we ended up shifting in the 14 has that glamour-esque approach. So it's all about the look of something, not essentially what that something can do for you. because everything's just a stat stick within the world of 14, which keeps it simple. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, it keeps it simple. And from a balancing design perspective, it makes it so much easier for them to sit down and actually put out a fight, because outside of the fact the recent, raid drama and balance issues, imagine how insane those balance issues would be if all of a sudden you have to start factoring in all these other types of gear and perks and build variety. It wouldn't work within the budget and the scope of 14. But I still like that. Like anything that I can do to invest and have something that I own and carries forward. And then if there is a gear score increase, to infuse that item that I like and I like how it works for me with power, that still counts as that level horizontal. And that's, I think, where I bring up Destiny as an example. The power can keep going up, but you also have this collection of guns that are unique, that they change how you play the game. And yes, and just like in Destiny, they'll make a change and that gun could be OP now, or it could be complete garbage. So there's always going to be that structure. And I think 14 has less of that. You usually see that within like horizontal, like your point of downsides. Where you see that the most in 14 is in its horizontalness, right? We're seeing issues people have with machinist, in the certain raid content. And it's because that is that idea, that investment that you make into that. That is what a piece that makes your character maybe unique as opposed to somebody else.
So when you start to talk about lateral variety, you hit on one of the big strengths of horizontal, as somebody that spends a lot of time in Guild Wars compared to you, but not compared to many of the people in chat and stuff here on Twitch that always have kind of the answers when I get stuck. You hit on something really great. Relics and legendaries across World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy, they have to be something that has a catch-up mechanic. So if you come in mid-expansion, you can play catch-up. And they have to be something that builds across the expansion, but then drops with the next expansion, or else they become overpowered or required. And so inevitably they have an expiration date. And after that expiration date, they're mostly used for cosmetics. Occasionally something ticks in, like you have things like Ultimate in 14 that uses old gear. Every once in a while there's something, people create twink characters in WoW and stuff. So every once in a while there's like some peculiar offshoot where that stuff matters. And, but like the typical person is never going to need to acquire that gear for any reason. Guild Wars knows that they're legendary. Once you have it forever and ever and ever. And so they can make that grind as long as they think is fun. And so I am in the middle of progressing towards a amount that, could take you days, weeks, months, depending on how you get at it. Because once I get it, I'll have it account wide forever and ever. And so like I'm taking my time. I'm not using guides. And so they give me little hints and I'm solving all the puzzles as we go. Because like I don't see any reason to rush it, because once I have it, as opposed to like, well, that mount's only good until, oh my gosh, 6 weeks from now. Okay, well then just give me the guide. Like, let's just get it, because it's not worth anything after that. So like there is a huge advantage that you hit on there. When you're talking about gear variety and being able to invest in kind of your build or invest directly in your gear, either in the way you forge it or in the way you grow it, that starts to move much closer to action RPGs. Diablo feels like you really do invest in what gear you equip to your character, and you may even hold on to old pieces in case, if I find this other thing, I'm going to want that back. Now, when you talk about investing in the gear itself, not cosmetically, but actually, and you say spare no expense, one of the things Yoshi P's hit on time and time again in 14 is I wish I had the budget of WoW. And what I will tell you is WoW has had spare no expense available to them the whole time. And so, and it has not always worked out to their advantage.
Right. Of course.
Because if they have an idea, they can follow it to the ends of the earth, and they do. And so they have had these gear progression systems like you're talking about. The most recent one that jumps to mind is Azerite. And so basically what you do is you get a piece of gear, and it has these like a sphere grid type thing on it, but you're going to pick one thing from each level as you push experience into it. And it's going to make that piece of gear unique to what you want from it. And it's going to drive its kind of item level up, and you're going to invest in it rather than replace it. And so it kind of made experience in a way, it kind of made you want to go level that up. And the way you had to like basically push Azerite power into that so that you had enough power. And so you end up kind of saying, okay, well, how cool. Now I have everything I need from the tribal dailies. Well, now every time I do my new tribal dailies, Yes, I don't need the mount anymore, but those tribal dailies give me a lot of Azerite power. And so you start to give use and value to continuing to do your dailies and continuing to do your hunts, even after you've hit tome cap for the week. And that sounds really great. It describes a lot of what you're talking about. Where that can become problematic, it doesn't always, I mean, maybe it doesn't always have to be, but where that became problematic in WoW is that now people did the math and found, okay, these particular pieces of gear upgraded in this way are the best. And because they are the best, now doing tribal dailies and doing your hunts and doing deep dungeon becomes mandatory.
Yeah. Mandatory is one of the things that I think 14, I can respect that a lot, because it's the optional becomes fun. Because when things become mandatory, that's where I get frustrated. You know, like I talked about I love PSO2, but to really progress in New Genesis is like, you got to log in every day. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm just not going to do with that. And so that is a weird thing that we've seen happen with WoW. And also the bar, like the idea that you then invest in it and then eventually it hits the floor is also very frustrating. What you want with the horizontal piece is that you want to be able to get it and then have that satisfaction and then being able to use that in terms of things that are going forward. And we've seen that, this is from my history, is that Final Fantasy 11, there's like pieces of gear that you'd get at level 20 and level 40 that were best in slot. Like that was and remained to be such a valuable piece at level cap and beyond because of like perks and things like that. And it was beautiful. Like it's a lot of people were like, oh man, it was hard to get. It wasn't guaranteed, right? And so I think that we've seen with Vertical is that it is kind of a candy factory. You know, you're like, oh yeah, this is sweet, felt good, okay, and then immediately there's something else to chase. There's a, you know, as opposed to like, and so we made everything easy, quick, disposable, and there's a value in that. And then one of the values in that is people come into 14 and they can get caught up. They're not like, imagine right now outside of MSQ is the biggest time gate in 14 as opposed to any kind of gearing up. Because if somebody wants to start in 7.0, let's say I take a break, because I'm considering taking a break. I'm going to see how the Criterion dungeons fit for me. And maybe I'm going to go ahead and just take a break. And if I step back into 7.0, I can immediately get geared up and I can go. Like nothing I'm doing right now really has a value outside of, you know, leveling, which I've already done. So it's like, okay, what do I want to do? So on that, like, that's how I kind of like, man, it'd be really nice, but you have to have that core design right at the foundation of the game. It's not something that's ever going to get tacked on later, because that's just going to be frustrating. And that's where like my hope is that when we look at the MMO, like as it evolves over the next decade, it's like you can have both systems, and the question is like, where does that make the most sense in terms of the reality of us as gamers? You know, we don't have all the time to play all the games or one game all the time, you know, and most people find joy in a variety of games. In fact, Triangle Strategy just came out on Steam, you know, so if you guys haven't played that game, like it's incredible. It's a really great game. Now it's more of a book with some fights that kind of pop into it, but it's still such a great game. You know, so having that ability to like kick back and like, okay, I want to go play another game for a little bit and not have this like overbearing sense of like, oh, I'm behind, is a value. So there's values in both systems. I just think that we're not there in terms of that. You know, I don't think we're close to what we'd consider the theoretical utopian MMO out there in terms of
WoW systems always sound like it. When they're announcing them at BlizzCon, they sound like utopian. So like people can look back and say what was wrong with each system in hindsight. But when you go back and look at BlizzCons, they are almost unanimously cheered at a lot of these changes. Yeah. This is what's going to be great about Shadowlands. This is what's going to be great about Battle for Azeroth. This is what's going to be great. And like, we're excited. The flaws come out because they are changing systems so rapidly.
Yeah.
They change systems every 2 years. And so they never get a chance. You get these cracks in the system and they patch the cracks, but they never go back and fundamentally change the system to become a version 2.0. They're always massively pulling the rug out and rebuilding it from the ground up. And so every system never quite matures. And when we look at Guild Wars, those systems are mature. And like the people who've been there 9 years are like, yeah, and it's kind of boring. Like I know what I'm doing. And people who are in 14 sometimes say, yeah, and I know what I'm doing, and it's kind of boring, but it works. It works. It functions. And like Diablo 2, as it starts to get new content and stuff, people who've been playing it for years and years, it works, and it can be kind of boring. But the advantage is that the changes have become small and perfecting, and they become small and like we're just adjusting course slightly. And when we're arguing over flaws, when people in the community are saying, well, this is wrong, we're usually talking about like single-digit percentages, or we're talking about like, oh, this one class on this one build is no longer valid in this one piece of content, but like every other build on that class is, or every other class is. And so like you're sitting there and the majority of the game is very, very healthy, and we're fighting over this one little thing. We're not fighting over like the entire game is on fire. Because that wouldn't be fun. It's like, it's fun to fight over, like, I love this game, let's fight about the one thing that's wrong. That's way more fun than everything's on fire, I think I'm just going to go play something else.
Right, exactly.
So I think these games that stick to their guns, it's a little easier to be like really passionate about the one or two things you wish were different. Because I'll tell you, the one game that's gotten to spare no expense is WoW. And like, that has not, kind of like Amazon with their servers with New World. People are like, man, if an MMO ever just had unlimited servers at launch, it would fix all their problems. And then you came across an MMO that had unlimited servers at launch, and it did fix that problem. It kicked it into a new set of problems that no other MMOs ever had.
Right.
So like, it created a new
behind this door.
So yeah, you know, I think that's. I think my last question is based on this whole conversation. A lot of what you describe is at its best in Guild Wars 2, where to a new player, the game still has a lot of verticality, and the game overall has a ton of horizontal. And so if you ever take a break, if you ever need to just go slowly, everything you're doing is slowly progressing in a way that is permanent and yours forever and is meaningful to varying degrees. And so like when I'm off doing all the jump puzzles, that's just cool. But as I get this mount will make a substantial difference in the way I travel the world forever and ever.
Yeah.
What do you think stops you from spending more time in Guild Wars?
Lack of controller support and a lack of flexibility over to play. It's a like gaming for me as a dad is a path of least resistance. So it's whatever is the easiest thing for me to jump into at a moment's notice. And 14 with Steam Deck, and I think I've heard that people got it running Guild Wars running on Steam Deck, but that is literally what ends up driving that. The fact that I can run New World on Steam Deck, also very easy. It's just like, what can I jump into? I have a little bit of time. I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z. And so I generally have been, and when we talk about ease of access, New World's so much more easier to access than 14. So it's like, that's where I just kind of go into, but that's because again, like I've got the Steam Deck and I have like Shadow PC and I've got GeForce Now. So it's like those things are the case. So you GeForce Now does run, Guild Wars 2 does run on that, but again, if it would be just nice and easy to kick back, play a little bit and be able to set that in. So as I've gotten older, it's not necessarily about the time investment. It's about how to jump in. And I've seen that. And you've heard me complain about that when I sat down to play Horizon and I was like, oh, it's got a 20-minute update. Like, I guess I'm not playing Horizon today. Like, okay, you know, this system is supposed to update automatically. What the hell? So on that note, that is going to be kind of it for the show. I've got the links in Twitch over there. If you guys want to go jump in and join Chris as he continues on his crazy journeys through the world of Guild Wars. We'll be back live Wednesday. For those of you who haven't seen, we've been running these live shows, and we appreciate you all for being here. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one, but until then, take care. Boo-boo. Cool. And I got to get ready for my first day of work. So guys, go hang out with Chris. Appreciate y'all being here. If you hang out here or you're just lurking here, should actually run you into a premiere of our console discussion that we had as well. So hopefully you guys stick around. Thanks guys for the 37 likes. Appreciate y'all so much. And I'm looking forward to talking with Chris about Criterion Dungeons and stuff like that, because we'll be able to go hands-on with that tomorrow. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna hit end broadcast and let it spin itself